What if 300 men could hold back an army of hundreds of thousands? What if a single narrow pass, carved between cliffs and sea, could become the most legendary battlefield in all of human history? In the year 480 before the birth of Christ, on a thin strip of land in northern Greece, something happened that should have been impossible. A small band of warriors stood face to face with the largest military force the ancient world had ever assembled. They did not survive, but what they did in those 3 days did not just delay an empire. It changed the course of Western civilization forever. And here's the part that history books rarely tell you. The 300 men who stood at Thermopylae did not go there by accident. They were chosen, hand-selected by a king who already knew they would never come home. A king who looked his men in the eyes, told them what was waiting, and then asked them to follow him anyway. Every single one of them said yes. This is not just a story about war. It is a story about what human beings are capable of when they decide that some things are worth dying for. It is a story about identity, sacrifice, and the terrifying clarity of a choice made by ordinary men in the shadow of impossible odds. So stay with me, because by the end of this you will understand why the Battle of Thermopylae is still studied in military academies around the world today. Why the word Spartan has become synonymous with endurance and toughness across every culture on Earth. And why 300 soldiers, against all logic and reason, chose to stand still while the world closed in around them. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand Thermopylae, you first have to understand Sparta. Not the Sparta of Hollywood films, not the dramatized version with stylized armor and slow-motion combat sequences. The real Sparta. Because the real Sparta was, in many ways, far stranger and far more terrifying than anything a screenwriter could invent. Sparta was a city-state located in the southern region of Greece, known as the Peloponnese. It sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, isolated from the rest of the Greek world in a way that shaped everything about its culture. But what truly defined Sparta was not its geography. It was its people. More precisely, it was what Sparta did to its people from the very first breath they took. When a Spartan child was born, the decision of whether that child would live or die was not left to the parents. Newborns were inspected by elders. If deemed weak or unfit, they were taken to a cliff on the slopes of Mount Taygetus and left to die. It was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as necessity. Sparta could not afford weakness. Those who passed that first inspection entered a world designed entirely around one purpose: the creation of the perfect warrior. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and entered a brutal state education system known as the agoge. The word itself means raising or training, but that translation does not quite capture what the agoge actually was. It was a systematic transformation of a child into something closer to a weapon. Boys in the agoge were intentionally underfed and expected to steal food to survive. If they were caught stealing, they were not punished for the theft. They were punished for being caught. Boys slept on reeds. They had to cut themselves from the riverbanks. They went barefoot in all weather. They wore a single garment through summer heat and winter cold. They were beaten regularly, not as punishment, but as training. They learned to endure pain without making a sound. At 12, the training intensified. Boys were paired with older mentors, taught combat, strategy, and endurance. They participated in ritualized battles against each other that were sometimes genuinely lethal. At 18, young Spartan men entered a phase called the Krypteia, a secret service period during which they were sent into the countryside alone, armed only with a knife, with the task of surviving off the land and hardening themselves against every form of weakness the world could offer. At 30, a Spartan man was considered a full citizen and warrior. By that point, he had spent more than 2 decades being broken and rebuilt. He had learned that comfort was an enemy. That pain was just information. That dying in battle was not a tragedy, but an honor. And that dying in retreat or in surrender was the only true disgrace a Spartan could suffer. There is a famous exchange recorded by the ancient historian Plutarch. A Spartan mother, handing her son his shield as he prepared to march to battle, said simply, "Come back with it," or "on it." Either return carrying your shield in victory, or return dead, carried upon it. Never drop your shield and run. Never. That single phrase tells you everything you need to know about the world that produced the 300 men who stood at Thermopylae. Now, let us turn to the other side of this story, because you cannot understand the battle without understanding the man who sent an empire marching into Greece. His name was Xerxes. In the Persian language, the name meant something like ruling over heroes. He was the son of Darius the Great, king of the Achaemenid Empire, the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen. Persia had expanded from the banks of the Indus River in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west, absorbing Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, and dozens of other kingdoms. Conquered peoples were generally left to maintain their customs and religions as long as they paid tribute and acknowledged Persian supremacy. But Greece was different. Greece had not submitted, and that refusal had a history. In 490 before the birth of Christ, 10 years before Thermopylae, Darius had sent a military expedition to Greece to punish Athens and Eretria for supporting a rebellion of Greek city-states in western Anatolia. That expedition had ended in one of the most famous upsets in military history. At the plain of Marathon, a relatively small Athenian force had met the Persian army and, against all expectations, destroyed it. The Persian fleet turned around and sailed home. Darius never returned. He died before he could organize a second invasion. His son Xerxes inherited both the empire and the unfinished business. The wound of Marathon never fully healed. Greek defiance was a stain on the empire's reputation, a dangerous example that resistance to Persian power was possible. Xerxes could not leave it unanswered. By 483 before the birth of Christ, he had made his decision. He would not send another expedition. He would not dispatch a punitive force. He would gather the full military weight of the Persian Empire and march it into Greece himself. He would end the question permanently. The scale of what Xerxes assembled was almost beyond comprehension. Modern scholarship generally estimates the Persian force at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, supported by a naval fleet of several hundred warships. Soldiers came from every corner of the empire: Persian infantry, Median cavalry, Egyptian marines, Lydian archers, Scythian horsemen, Babylonian soldiers, Indian warriors. It was less an army than a mobilized world. To cross from Asia into Europe, Xerxes ordered pontoon bridges built across the Hellespont. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, he reportedly ordered the waters whipped as punishment. New bridges were built. In the spring of 480 before the birth of Christ, the Persian army began crossing into Europe. It took 7 days and 7 nights for the entire force to cross. Meanwhile, in Greece, word of what was coming had been spreading for months. The Greek city-states faced a crisis that exposed every fault line in their fractured political world. Greece was not a unified country. It was a collection of independent city-states, many actively hostile to one another. Many smaller city-states had already decided that resistance was pointless. They sent earth and water to Persian envoys, the traditional symbols of submission, before Xerxes had even crossed the Hellespont. But a coalition of 31 city-states, led by Athens and Sparta, decided to resist. The question was how. Themistocles, the Athenian general and statesman, had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. He had convinced Athens to invest its silver mine revenues in building a powerful fleet of warships called triremes. His vision was a naval strategy: draw the Persians into confined waters where their numerical superiority would be neutralized and destroy them ship by ship. But a naval strategy required time to execute. The Greek fleet needed to be in position, and before that could happen, the Persian army needed to be slowed down. The geography of Greece itself offered an answer. North of Athens, the coastline narrows at a place called Thermopylae. The name in Greek means hot gates, a reference to the sulfurous hot springs that bubbled up from the rocks nearby. At Thermopylae, the mountains of central Greece come down almost to the edge of the sea, leaving only a narrow coastal path. At its tightest point, the pass was no wider than a wagon track, perhaps 15 meters across. A force defending that passage would neutralize the Persian advantage in numbers almost completely. No matter how many soldiers Xerxes had, he could only send a handful at a time through the pass. The Greek strategy called for holding Thermopylae long enough for the naval engagement at nearby Artemisium to play out. By time, hold the gate. Let the ships do their work. If both operations succeeded, the Persian invasion might be stopped or at least fatally delayed. The responsibility for holding Thermopylae fell to Sparta, the dominant land power in the Greek coalition. The Spartan king who would lead the defense was Leonidas. He was not a young man, likely in his late 50s at the time of the battle. But Leonidas was deeply respected, both within Sparta and among the allied Greeks. He was steady, experienced, and he understood exactly what the mission at Thermopylae actually meant. Here is what makes the story of Leonidas so extraordinary. When he chose the 300 Spartans who would accompany him to Thermopylae, he did not simply select his best warriors. He selected men who already had living sons, men whose family lines would continue after them, men who could die without ending the Spartan bloodline they represented. Leonidas knew, with the calm certainty of a man who had spent his entire life being trained not to flinch from reality, that the force he was leading to Thermopylae was very likely marching to its death. He chose them anyway, and they went willingly. The force that marched north was not, of course, only 300 Spartans. The coalition assembled roughly 7,000 soldiers in total, including contingents from Thebes, Thespiae, Corinth, Arcadia, and other city-states. But the Spartans were the core, the professionals, the men around whom everyone else organized themselves. They arrived at Thermopylae and found a defensible position that suited their purpose almost perfectly. The pass ran between steep cliffs on one side and the sea on the other. Within the pass itself, there was an old defensive wall, partially collapsed, that the Greeks quickly rebuilt. Behind them, the path broadened into open ground where a larger force could maneuver. Ahead, the narrow throat of the pass funneled everything into a killing ground no wider than a few wagon lengths. And then they waited. The Persian army arrived and made camp on the plain to the north. Xerxes sent scouts ahead to observe the Greek position. The scouts reported back something that apparently struck Xerxes as almost comically absurd. The Spartans at the wall were doing calisthenics. They were exercising, grooming their long hair, and generally behaving as if they were on a training day rather than standing in the path of the largest army on earth. Xerxes reportedly consulted with Demaratus, a former Spartan king living in Persian exile, and asked him what this behavior meant. Demaratus told him the truth. When Spartan men prepare their hair and exercise in full view of an enemy, it means they intend to fight to the death. They're not afraid. They are preparing. Xerxes apparently did not believe it. He waited 4 days, perhaps expecting the Greeks to lose their nerve and retreat. They did not move. On the 5th day, Xerxes ordered the attack. The first Persian units sent through the pass were the Medes, some of the empire's most experienced soldiers. They advanced in dense formations, confident in their numbers and their reputation. What happened next was a shock to everyone watching from the Persian side. The Spartans did not simply stand and hold. They employed a tactic that was psychologically devastating as much as it was militarily effective. They would advance in a disciplined line, draw the Persians into engagement, and then feign a retreat. The Persians, believing they had broken the Greek formation, would surge forward in pursuit, their own formation dissolving into a disorganized rush. And then the Spartans would turn around. A Spartan phalanx turning around was not a retreat interrupted. It was a reorganized killing machine swinging back at full force. The Persians, now disordered and overextended, ran directly into the wall of Spartan shields and spears. The slaughter was catastrophic. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers entered the pass and were destroyed. The Medes were pulled back. Other units were sent forward. Elamites, elite Persian immortals, the legendary 10,000 who were considered the finest soldiers in the empire. They too were driven back. The terrain amplified every advantage the Greeks possessed. The Spartans used long spears called doru, standing behind large shields in tight formations. In the narrow pass, Persian cavalry was useless. Persian archers, the weapon system that had won battles across the empire, could not find clean angles of fire without hitting their own men. The numbers that made the Persian army invincible in open terrain became an irrelevance, and then a liability, as bodies piled up in the choke point and soldiers scrambling over their own dead found their footing destroyed. At the end of the first day, the Persians had suffered massive casualties. The Greeks had held. Xerxes, watching from a throne set up on a hillside above the battlefield, reportedly rose to his feet 3 times during the fighting in alarm for his men. The second day brought more of the same. Fresh Persian units were sent forward. Fresh Persian units were broken. The Greeks rotated their own forces, maintaining a relatively fresh front line, while the Persians exhausted themselves on repeated assaults. The mood in the Greek camp was, by all accounts, extraordinary. They knew what they were doing. They understood the stakes, and they were winning against an empire with a wagon track's worth of geography and their own absolute refusal to break. Leonidas, watching from within the pass, must have understood something essential about what was happening. The Battle of Thermopylae was not a strategic operation anymore. It had become something else. It had become a statement. 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies telling the largest empire on earth, in the most direct language possible, that Greece would not simply hand itself over. But then, on the night of the second day, everything changed. His name was Ephialtes. He was a Greek, a local man from the region of Thessaly. He came to the Persian camp and offered Xerxes something the great king had been unable to find in 2 days of brutal fighting: a way around. There was a mountain path, Ephialtes told the Persians, that wound over the hills behind Thermopylae. It was difficult but passable. If a Persian force moved through it overnight, they could emerge behind the Greek position by morning. The Greeks would be surrounded. The pass would no longer save them. Xerxes immediately ordered the elite Persian immortals, under the command of a general named Hydarnes, to take the path. They moved out in the darkness. The Greeks were not entirely unaware that the mountain path existed. Leonidas had posted a force of 1,000 soldiers from the city-state of Phocis to guard it. But the Phocians, when the immortals emerged from the forest at dawn, panicked. They fell back to higher ground to protect themselves, and the Persian column swept past them without stopping. By early morning, the immortals were descending the far side of the hills, moving toward the rear of the Greek position. A messenger reached Leonidas with the news just as dawn was breaking. What happened next is one of the most debated moments in ancient history. Leonidas called a council. The situation was now hopeless. There was no longer any strategic purpose served by holding the pass. The rational decision was to withdraw and preserve the coalition's forces for the battles that would follow. Leonidas ordered most of the Greek allied contingents to withdraw. The Thebans, who had been reluctant participants and whose city was suspected of Persian sympathy, were kept back, possibly against their will. The Thespians, 700 men from the small city of Thespii, chose voluntarily to stay. They knew that their city lay directly in the path of the Persian advance and had no illusions about what was coming for them. They chose to die fighting rather than to survive and watch their home be destroyed anyway. And the 300 Spartans stayed. No reliable source records exactly what Leonidas said to them in those final hours. The ancient writers offer fragments, reconstructions, legendary dialogues. What we know is what they did. They ate breakfast. They checked their equipment. When a Persian emissary reportedly told them that Persian arrows were so numerous they would blot out the sun, a Spartan soldier named Dionys reportedly answered, "Good. Then we will fight in the shade." Whether that exchange is literally true or an embellishment added by later historians, it captures something real about the state of mind of those men. They had passed through the point where fear is the dominant emotion. They had arrived somewhere on the other side of it. The final battle of Thermopylae was fought on the morning of the third day. Knowing they were surrounded, knowing that no reinforcements were coming, knowing that this was the last morning of their lives, the 300 Spartans and the 700 Thespians did not stand passively behind the wall and wait to be overwhelmed. They moved forward. They advanced into the open ground in front of the pass, forcing the Persians to engage them in a broader space where the dying would at least be on the Greeks' terms. The fighting was savage beyond description. Spears broke. Men drew swords. When swords were lost or broken, they fought with their hands and their teeth. Ancient accounts describe Leonidas himself dying in the forward press of the battle, and the Greeks fighting 4 times to recover his body from the Persians who tried to take it. By midday, it was over. The last Spartans and Thespians died where they had been fighting. There were no prisoners. There was no surrender. The pass was open. Persian losses in the 3 days at Thermopylae were staggering. Ancient sources give numbers that are almost certainly exaggerated, but even conservative modern estimates suggest that Xerxes lost somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 soldiers. For a force that had expected to walk through Greece, it was an unacceptable price. And it was only the beginning of what Greece would cost him. Because here is what Thermopylae actually accomplished. It bought Athens time to evacuate its civilian population. It demonstrated to every wavering Greek city-state that Persia was not unstoppable. It transformed the Persian invasion from a triumphal procession into a grinding campaign. And it gave the Greek coalition a symbol of such overwhelming moral force that it changed the psychological character of the entire war. Weeks after Thermopylae, the Greek fleet under Themistocles lured the Persian navy into the narrow waters of the Strait of Salamis near Athens and destroyed it. Without naval support, the Persian army could no longer be reliably supplied. Xerxes, having burned Athens but finding it empty of people, withdrew to Asia with much of his force. The rump Persian army left in Greece was destroyed at the Battle of Plataea the following year. The invasion was over. Greece had survived. Xerxes never returned to Greece. The empire he led continued for another century and a half before being dismantled by Alexander of Macedon. But the dream of Persian dominion over Europe died at Thermopylae and at Salamis. The Greeks erected a monument at Thermopylae. On it, they inscribed a short poem written by the poet Simonides that has been translated and retranslated and quoted for 2,500 years. The lines, in their most familiar English form, read, "Go, stranger, and tell the Lacedaemonians that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Lacedaemon was the proper name for the Spartan state. The poem does not speak of glory or heroism. It speaks of obedience, of doing what you were asked to do and dying where you stood because that is what was required of you. It is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing in the ancient world. The legacy of Thermopylae did not remain confined to ancient Greece. It became a template for how human beings think about sacrifice and the meaning of standing your ground. Roman writers studied it. Military strategists across the ages have returned to it not just for tactical lessons, but for something harder to define, a kind of moral instruction about what disciplined courage actually looks like when stripped of all illusion. In the modern era, the battle has been reimagined in films, novels, and video games. Some are more faithful to history than others. But the core of the story endures through all of them because the core is not really about Sparta at all. It is about the human capacity to look at something overwhelming and frightening and enormous, and to decide that it does not matter, that the decision has already been made, that the only thing left to do is stand. There is something important, however, that history requires us to say honestly about Sparta. The society that produced those 300 men was also a society built on the backs of an enslaved population called the Helots, subjected to systematic terror as a tool of control. Sparta was not a democracy. The discipline that made those 300 so formidable was purchased at a price paid by hundreds of thousands of people who had no say in it. Thermopylae can be honored without pretending that the civilization it came from was without darkness. The bravery was real, the sacrifice was real, and the cruelty of the Spartan system was equally real. Both things are true. What happened at the Hot Gates in 480 before the birth of Christ was a collision between two worlds, each complex, each capable of extraordinary things. The Persian Empire would last another century and a half. Sparta itself would eventually be defeated by Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 before the birth of Christ, its military dominance permanently broken. All empires end. All powers rise and fall. But what those men did in that pass in those 3 days, with everything they had been and everything they believed themselves to be, that does not end. It changes shape, it gets retold, it gets distorted and embellished and argued over by historians across 25 centuries. But it does not disappear, because it answers a question that human beings keep asking in every era and every language. Not how do you win, but how do you stand when winning is no longer possible and the only thing left to decide is who you will be in the moment before it is over. The 300 answer that question at Thermopylae. They came back on their shields. The names of those 300 men were engraved on a monument at Sparta. Not as heroes, not as legends, simply as citizens who did what was required. The simplicity of that act, the complete absence of self-drama in it, is perhaps the most enduring lesson of all. History does not always belong to those who survive. Sometimes it belongs to those who refuse to run, and sometimes a narrow pass between mountains and sea becomes the place where the entire direction of the world quietly shifts. If this story moved you, if the weight of what those men chose still sits with you, then hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment below telling us which moment in this battle struck you hardest. Every week we go deep into the stories that change the world, the ones that go far beyond the surface, the ones that explain not just what happened, but why it still matters. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. This channel grows because of people like you, and there are so many more stories waiting.